Hello, Mr. Blair, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I trust you and your family are keeping well during these unusual and surreal times.
Yes, thank you very much. And I wish all the very best to you, to your family, and to the community.
Thank you. So if I may begin in the first instance by asking you, different countries, different governments seem to be taking varied approaches to this pandemic. Looking a little closer to home, what is your take on the current handling of the COVID-19 here in the UK?
So I always start an answer to that question by saying this is the most difficult challenge I've ever seen in government. I mean, this is an unprecedented, unique event. It imposes extraordinary burdens of organization and logistics upon the government. And so I have every sympathy for the people trying to deal with this. I think probably in reality, we were, somewhat too slow to lock down. And what is necessary now is to make sure that, having gone through an extremely difficult period and with the possibility of having to live with the disease for some time, I think the single most important thing now is to try and emerge back into something like normal. It'll be a new normal as soon as we can. And for me, the absolute key to that, before we get a vaccine that works, is to have mass testing. So I think that's the thing my institute's been saying throughout this. And I still think whether we end up coming out of this in reasonable shape or not will depend on whether we built what I call the infrastructure of containment, of which the ability to test and then to trace and to track potential cases is the single biggest component.
Right. Okay. Well, let's look at the fallout from it. I mean, for a number of years, we've been living in reasonably good times. The economy has been doing overall fine. People have been relatively prosperous. And then, of course, it all turned in a matter of weeks. So what do you believe to be the financial implications or the fallout from the current crisis? I mean, there are a number of public companies already going into liquidation. Hope for the small business, hope for the average businessman. Where do we see things going?
Yeah, so I think that the economic fallout is immense for two reasons. First of all, even if you go back to a new normal, if you take just the airline industry or hospitality, tourism, bricks and mortar retail, there are a whole set of industries that are going to be in a lot of trouble, some for quite a long period of time, some frankly just won't be viable. So I think when you look at the potential economic damage of this, it's enormous. I mean, I'm really, really worried about the economic impact. I think that, during the course of the lockdown and with the government's various schemes of support, it's obviously the right thing to do to help people through the crisis, you can get an air of unreality about the economic wreckage that we will face once we emerge from this, because you can't keep this support going forever. So that's the biggest worry I have, which is why getting the wheels of the economy spinning again, turning, is just so important, because otherwise, we will end up imposing a very long-term burden on future generations.
So, I mean, with that, the furlough scheme, so you mentioned about government help, it's a mega billion-pound undertaking. And it occurs to me that taxes are going to have to be raised significantly at some point just to deal with the level of debt. Was there an alternative? Is there an alternative?
It's so difficult to work out whether people in a couple of years' time look back with hindsight and say, oh my goodness, we all overreacted. But I think the reality is virtually every country or every developed country around the world has been taking extraordinary and unusual measures to deal with this. The problem is that when you come back out of it again, as I say, some industries aren't going to recover, or some businesses won't recover. And then I also think that some businesses will have operated differently during the lockdown and will carry on operating differently. If you just take my own organization, my institute's got maybe 250, 300 people working for us in London and different parts of the world. We've managed to carry on working reasonably well throughout this. I think probably at the end of it, there are certain changes to the way we work, things we do, things we don't do, that will be permanent. So all of this means there's going to be, there's the consequence of it is not just short term, I think it'll be long term. And for government, you can't carry on with these furlough schemes forever. It's going to have to end them. And then it's going to have to, as I say, get the wheels of business going again. I think that there will also be a need. Yes, of course, we'll have to address the burden of the spending that we will be doing. Fortunately, interest rates are very low, likely to remain low. But I also think we're going to have to look very carefully at how we organize ourselves. So, for example, I think when you're looking forward, it's not just a question of spending more money. It's also a question of saying, for example, how do we do healthcare differently from the lessons we've learned during the course of this crisis? How does government have to change, and change pretty fundamentally? What are the areas in which we can also save money, because we've learned there are different ways that we can do things? So I think there will be a massive national effort. And I think it's going to be really important for people to come together on this, for communities also to realize that, that they've got a common interest in trying to help all of us help each other through this. And I think there's got to be a very sector by sector look at business, with government working closely with the business sector to see what does the future look like? How do we shape it? What's the future of work? All of these things are going to be really difficult. Take universities, for example. They're going to lose billions of pounds a year from foreign students, at least for a time. And if you're a young person, you're thinking of going to university next year, do you want to take on student debt when you're not going to have the normal university experience, or may not? So all of these things, I think, it's going to require huge energy and focus. And my only plea out of it is that it should be done on a basis that's bringing people together as much as possible, not, highly party political. I think the answers to all these questions aren't really a matter of party politics or ideology. They're just practical analysis of what's going to work and what's not.
Right. You mentioned earlier about maybe lockdown having started a little bit late, and certain countries didn't do lockdown at all, and they're now sort of paying something of a price. If nothing else, this pandemic has exposed our real vulnerability. The Anglo-Jewish community, as a result, I would say, of a somewhat late lockdown, did lose an unusually large number of its members proportionate to its broader numbers, because we had a particular festival just before lockdown where many were gathered together in proximity. And you used the term new normal a few times now, which is, of course, being touted about. Do you think that there will be a fundamental change generally, notwithstanding the economy, in civilization, some sort of reset button, or are we at risk, as is all too often typical, at whatever point reverting to where we left off, and this just being a sad piece of history? And within that, is there a risk of coming out of lockdown too soon?
Yeah, so these are all difficult questions. First of all, please let me extend my deep sympathy and condolences to those in the Anglo-Jewish community that have lost people dear to them, members of their family, friends, and so on. And I know the community's been particularly hard hit. I think, well, it all depends what happens, frankly. So if there is a vaccine, and my institute's been quite heavily involved in looking at all the different vaccines that are potential game changers. If there's a vaccine that works, and we've got a few promising ones here in the UK, there are a few in the US, China, actually Israel, I think, is also developing one. And that obviously makes a big difference, because you then reduce the fear factor, and therefore socializing in the normal way becomes easier. But I think, even with a vaccine, and that is speculative and may take some time, no, I think there will be a change in behavior. And that's why I think you've got to really plan for what the future looks like. And you don't know how this disease then comes back in the autumn and winter. We don't know whether this is the last, well, it probably isn't the last pandemic we're going to get. So I think you're right. A lot of the weaknesses in the resilience of our systems have been exposed, and we're going to have to to make sure we plug those gaps and build that resilience. And probably for a time, people will travel and work with each other and socialize with each other differently. Yeah, I think that's, so this new normal, it will be different. And, you know, as I say, some of the changes that will be made will be changes because of people's fear, and some will be changes because people have experienced change and want to keep that change even after the lockdown ends. Is there a risk of it ending too soon? Yes, but I think there's also a risk of not moving back based on evidence fast enough. I mean, we now know a little more about the disease, or actually quite a lot more about, not enough, but quite a lot more about the disease now. We know that household transmission is the most common form. We know that public transport is the second most common. Big events with lots of people, that can be very dangerous for transmission. But, you know, if care is taken and some basic rules are observed, you know, there is life that can start again. And I think it's particularly important, for example, that we get schools back as soon as is reasonably possible. But you've then got to have this infrastructure in place, as I say, to be able to move if you notice an outbreak, because you will be, you know, you will find that as you open up again, you will get the outbreaks happening, and you've got to have the capacity, the ability then to go and suppress them very quickly.
And you mentioned, I mean, your institute has been directly involved in dealing with COVID. Can you share a little bit more of what you're doing, please?
Yeah, what we've really tried to do is we've just repurposed the policy side of the institute to looking at, you know, what are the right things to do around testing? What are the potential vaccines? How do we make sure, for example, that those vaccines are widely distributed? And we'd be looking at, as you emerge from lockdown, what is the right way for easing the lockdown? What's the proper calculus of risk? Because, you know, it's not just the damage COVID does directly to people's health, it's the indirect damage through other diseases not being treated, the economic damage that unemployment brings, and mental health damage that can bring as well. So there's a whole series of things we look at. Then, because we're working in Africa, we do a lot of work in Africa. We just published a report, and here's what's interesting. No, it's quite, one of the things that we're trying to look at in relation to this disease is, does it present itself differently in different countries and in different climates? And, you know, there's still a lot that's unexplained, but if you take the total number of recorded deaths in Africa, in all the 50-odd countries in Africa, the total number of deaths recorded is less than a tenth of the number of deaths in the UK. So there can be explanations for that are around inadequate testing, inadequate recording, and so on. But obviously something's going on there. India, 1.2 billion people, again, 3,500 deaths compared with 36,000 or more here. So there's things, you know, Israel's had a low number, really. Greece, Cyprus, most of the Arab countries have actually emerged reasonably okay. So there's lots of things we don't know, and that's the other thing we're trying to do, to assemble the evidence, because you've got to, if you're, for example, advising an African country how you emerge from lockdown, the truth of the matter is, as I'm looking at it at the moment, they are likely to have many more deaths through other diseases not being properly treated than they are through COVID. So these are the types of risk calculus you're going to have to engage with in different parts of the world.
Right. Well, since you mentioned Israel, if I may, if we can move away from COVID, you've been extensively involved, unlike perhaps any other in the Middle East. You initially appointed our mutual friend, Lord Levy, as Middle East envoy for a number of years. And then after leaving Downing Street, you were special envoy to the Middle East Quartet. And you're still very active. So a straight up question, is there hope? I mean, it's been so many years, so many attempts. Will we ever get to a lasting peace in the Middle East?
Yeah, I'm always asked if there's hope, and I always say there is. And as the years have gone on, people have always looked at me increasingly skeptically when I say that. And in the days when I was working with Michael, who did a great job, by the way, on our behalf, helping, we had a huge international focus, and we had different circumstances. So let me, I can bore you forever with it, but I won't. I mean, I'll just say two things. The biggest reason for hope in the Middle East as a whole is the emerging relationship between Israel and the Arab states, which is really what I've spent a lot of my time on the last few years. I've still got an office in Israel and in the Gulf, and we work a lot on this. That is a cause for real hope, because it isn't really just about the security relationship between Israel and the Arab states. Yes, it's true they've got security interests in common. They're both worried about Iran. But the other thing is there is a new and emerging leadership in the Middle East that really wants to modernize their countries, to make sure that religion is not abused and turned into a political ideology. And that is all positive. And I think in the end, that is the single biggest game changer for the Middle East. For the Palestinian question, look, I wrote an article about this some weeks back, which was really about the first article I've ever written where I've tried to set out, because I don't like to write a lot about it, because if you do, you always offend someone or other. I think the Israel-Palestine question is very difficult now, because there are proposals for the annexation of the Jordan Valley with the Israeli government. It's going to be very difficult to see how a Palestinian state survives that. On the other hand, there are no proper negotiations at the moment. Palestinian Authority just in the last few days has announced a withdrawal of cooperation from Israel. This is a very, very difficult thing. If you want to read a really good article, a friend of mine, Paulie Mordecai, who was the Israeli general in charge of the Palestinian territories, just wrote a piece in the last few days setting out the current situation, which I recommend to people. It's a very, very good article about the fragility of the Israeli-Palestinian thing. So what you've got in a curious way is almost an inversion of what we were dealing with in the times when Michael and I were dealing with this together. Whereas if you wheel the clock back 20 years, you'd say the Israeli relationship in the region was very problematic, and the Israeli-Palestinian issue had continual peace processes and chances of bringing some sort of agreement. Now it's almost inverted the other way around. I would say the Israeli-Palestinian track is pretty blocked right now, but the Israel regional situation is actually more promising. Now, I would obviously like to see the two of those align, and that's what we're working for, but we will see.
All right. Well, with all these things, I guess we live in hope. Mr. Blair, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. It's really, really genuinely appreciated on behalf of the whole Anglo-Jewish community, and I wish you and your family well.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. I wish you and your family well, and to the whole of the Anglo-Jewish community.
Thank you very much.